Very, very warm welcome to today's seminar here at SNS. My name is Mia Horna-Brandtjen and I am the CEO at SNS. Today's seminar is a part of a seminar series on democracy issues that we have had here and have here at SNS, where leading international and national Swedish social scientists present new research on important issues around democracy. And the starting point for this seminar series was last year's report, SNS Democracy Report 2017. In English, the title was Cooperation and Conflict in Parliamentary Democracy. I must say that it's still as relevant as it was a year ago, and I think there has been a lot of commenting on this report, and it's really worth reading. So I advise you to do so if you're interested in the Swedish scene as we are experiencing it right now. One of the most important issues which relates to democracy is political polarization. Therefore, we are very honored to have one of the world's leading researchers on this issue, Princeton professor Nolan McCarty. Most welcome. You are the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and co-author of the book Polarized America, The Dance of Ideology and Unequal Riches. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit us here at SNS in Stockholm. You say in your book that the idea of America as politically polarized has almost become a cliché. What you do show is that increasing polarization is closely accompanied by fundamental social and economic changes. And as we all know, polarization is not isolated to the US. Here in Sweden, there is an ongoing discussion. What signs could we be looking for? Is there increasing polarization in Sweden? And to provide a perspective on the Swedish situation, we welcome Lars Trägårdh. Most welcome. Professor of History and Civil Society Studies at Ersta, Sköndal, Bräcke University College. And currently you are heading a major research project on social trust. So, finally, I also welcome the journalist Åsa Julin, who will be moderating this seminar. Most welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Åsa Julin, as Mia said, and I will lead the discussion today about this highly interesting topic. Some of you might recognize me from TV4, where I used to be a newscaster. Nowadays, I'm a freelance journalist, and I moderate discussions here at SNS on a regular basis. So, as Mia said, we will listen to Professor Nolan McCarty and Professor Lars Trägårdh. After that, there will be a 20-minute joint discussion, and you are most welcome to participate. And I would like to remind you that you need to wait for a microphone and introduce yourselves before you speak. And if you use Twitter, which we of course encourage you to do, please use the hashtag SNSkunskap, SNSKUNSKAP in one word. That was for Mr. McCarty over there. But now please let's begin and join me in welcoming Professor Nolan McCarty.
Terrific. Good morning. I'm very delighted to have the invitation from SNS to talk to you about the research that I've been doing for much longer than I care to admit. In fact, one of the things I'd like you to keep in mind as I go through my various charts and figures about polarization and economic inequality is that my co-authors developed some of the ways of measuring polarization when I was in grade school in the 1980s. We began working together on explanations for polarization in the mid-1990s. We wrote the first version of Polarized America in 2003. It came out in 2004. That's the lag in academic publishing. and updated in 2015 and 2016. So one of the things you should keep in mind when I show you what's happened with polarization is that many of the things that we were saying in the 1990s continue to hold till today. Yet, with the election of Donald Trump, 2016, there are also some very fundamental differences, which I'll highlight as I go through. So with that preliminary, let me start with what the essence of our project is, and that is to understand three fundamental changes in the U.S. political economy. The first, of course, is the increased polarization of the political parties. And by this, I'm mainly going to focus on what we call elite polarization, the polarization of parties, their leaders, and their major activists. I can talk in the question and answer more about regular American voters and how they've polarized, but I'm really going to focus on the elites and the parties because that's where it started. The public came around, and they've come around big time recently, but the origins of polarization in the U.S. actually start at the top, not at the bottom. It's really about what major political leaders have decided strategically to do in light of the changing circumstances in the United States. The second feature I'm going to talk about is something that's also very salient about the United States, and that is the increase in economic inequality. I'll show you many figures to sort of back this up, but the levels of economic inequality in the United States were quite high even before polarization arrived, but they've only gotten higher and higher at levels that are kind of unparalleled in the kind of developed, advanced world. You have to go to developing countries to find either levels or trends of economic inequality that equal those of the United States. And finally, we also talk in the book about the role of increased immigration and migration. And this is obviously something that kind of travels comparatively and for which there are parallels in Sweden and the rest of Europe, the kind of the polarizing effect of immigration and mass migration. But the main project is really to try to understand how these things fit together. And we start with the observation that indicators of these features of the American political economy track each other for more than a century. In fact, there almost seems to be a symbiotic relationship between political polarization, economic inequality, and levels of mass migration. Okay, so let me just show you the evidence about the connection that these indicators go, and then I'll talk you through the basic argument about why they go together in the United States context, flag some issues for which it may or may not apply in other contexts, perhaps such as Sweden, and then talk about some kind of more recent research suggesting that there may be a causal relationship between economic inequality and polarization. So throughout the talk, I'm going to heavily rely on a measure of polarization that my co-authors and I sort of developed and refined over time. One of the things about the United States Congress is that most of its votes on legislation, its roll call votes, are free votes. They're unwhipped. So we can actually use data on roll call voting in Congress to get measures of where individual legislators stand on a left-right spectrum. I'll try throughout the talk to talk about left and right. I may slip into the American jargon and refer to conservative and liberal. I hope that doesn't confuse anybody when I say liberal to mean the left. I'll try not to do that. Okay. So using these roll call votes, the fact that they've been recorded, mostly unwhipped over time, we're able to measure polarization simply by looking at the differences between Republicans and Democrats on this left-right scale. Republicans are always farther right on the scale. Democrats are always farther left. And we can do that for the U.S. House and for the Senate. And so this plot simply shows the trends in both of those chambers, the upper chamber of the Senate and the lower chamber of the House, over the course of about the last 140-something years. These charts, I should say, began in 1877. Those of you who know something about American history might recognize that is the end of our Reconstruction following our Civil War. So it was a very divided time in American society. Obviously, one party represented the victorious Union. The other tended to represent the defeated regions, and so those partisan differences were quite great, and you can see that in the figure. There are a few takeaways I think that are important for understanding polarization in the U.S. that come from this figure. The first is that polarization varies. We've not always been polarized. In fact, from, say, the 1920s to the 1960s, there was not much differentiation between the parties. There were many left-wing Republicans, many right-wing Democrats. There was lots of bipartisanship in Congress. The parties were just not very distinctive or distinguished. Of course, all of that changed. And this is a big part of this talk. It all changed in the late 1970s when there became much greater differentiation with the parties as they tended to move apart, especially in Congress and on public policy. I should also acknowledge that these measures are somewhat driven by the agenda, the legislative agenda for Congress, and that tends to be heavily economic issues about budgets, regulations, the use of the federal government. So those are really, I think, the kind of key issues that are kind of driving these measures. A second takeaway point is that the House and the Senate are very similar. It's not a feature of either. Polarization is not an intrinsic feature of either institution. Third, there are really no major breaks, and this I think is important. There's no one singular event that caused the United States to become polarized. They're long-term trends. It's either flat for a long period of time, going down for a long period of time, or going up for 40 years, as we see. So things like the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, Bill Clinton 2000, Barack Obama. This is not the most updated figure, but if I had updated, you would not be able to tell the Trump difference. It's just going up. Okay. And then fourth, because it's a question that many people ask, they ask about some of the things that people are concerned about these days related to polarization, things like social media, etc. Clearly, the trends tend to precede any of those changes related to social media. So so this is all a way. So before I get into any other data, this is all a way of arguing that these are longer-term trends, which we should expect to see associated with changes. Deeper changes in American society. So let me talk about those deeper changes. Oh, I should mention one other fact before I move on. One of the things we can do with these measures is we can break them out by parties, and we can say, what's the average position of the Republican Party on this left-right scale? What's the average position of the Democrats on the scale? So one of the things that you can see is that the primary driver of polarization in the United States has been the movement of the Republican Party to the right. Very consistent with the strategies of what we call the conservative movement, libertarian movement, free market economics, to have a much greater influence over the Republican Party. And it's largely been successful, as you can see. Almost every new cohort of elected Republican officials is more conservative or more right-wing than the preceding cohort. That has not been true for the Democratic Party, which has essentially not changed its positions relative to the old positions in any real systematic way. So polarization in the United States is really a phenomenon of the increased prominence and dominance of the right over the Republican Party. And that's very consistent with what we see in the news today, so that's not changed. Okay, so let me say a little bit about economic inequality. As many of you may know, there's a kind of standard measure of economic inequality called the Gini index. It goes from 0 to 1. 0 means that it's a completely equal society. 1 is like a society where Warren Buffett, Bill Gates own everything. I believe Sweden is somewhere around 0.25. The United States is considerably higher than that, as you can see. Even at its lowest point, the Gini index was about 10 points higher than Sweden's is right now, but has only grown dramatically over the course of the last 40 years, almost in parallel with political polarization. So at least they tend to move together. There are other measures which I can use to kind of document that. Perhaps one of the most famous measures of economic inequality in use now are those measures by the economists Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty, whose book that millions have bought but hundreds have read. But it's still a very influential measure, and it's simply what percentage of national income goes to the top 1% of all taxpayers. And this we can take back to, in the United States, to 1913, the origins of our income tax, and we can see that there's kind of a rough correspondence there as well, going back further. But and a point I want to highlight is it seems, if anything, polarization tends to precede these gains for the top 1%. That is, as polarization tends to rise, it tends to drive economic inequality. And I think that's a very important component not to forget, that polarization in the United States tends to kind of reduce the activism of government in dealing with economic problems. And so there is some slight evidence for that. These relationships are true if you go to the 0.1%, the 10th of 1% of income, or even the stratospheric. So really, the higher up you go on the income scale for these measures of top income shares, the correlation between that and polarization still exists. So there seems to be some important connections between those. In fact, I think, as you can see, the correlation between the very tippy top incomes was actually higher than those of the mere 1%. Okay. So polarization and economic inequality have tended to move together quite closely. Let me move to the third trend, immigration, just kind of a crash course on immigration history of the United States. The United States more or less had open immigration throughout almost all of the 19th century, with the exception of restrictions on Asian immigration, until about 1920, when it passed its first Immigration Restriction Act, which basically limited immigration to the countries of Northern and Western Europe. And then in 1965, opened immigration back up, perhaps mostly to the world, and has since then been kind of a destination for not only kind of political refugees, but also economic migrants, particularly from Latin America, but increasingly now from Asia. So the triangles on this figure show the percentage of the American population at any point in time which is foreign-born. This tracks very well with immigration rates, so it doesn't matter whether you're thinking of like the stock of immigrants or the flow of immigrants. But you can see during periods of which the rates of immigration were high, polarization was quite high. During this period between 1920 and 1960, where there were very few immigrants, most people were born in the United States, overwhelming percentage of people were born in the United States, there was less polarization, and it only began to increase at roughly the same time. So the issues tend to move together. Of course, that's not any kind of indication of any sort of causality. So one of the things we do in the book is to try to look at, well, is there really a relationship between these factors or not? Before I do that, I want to stress what I think is kind of the broader puzzle of our work. Going all the way back to Aristotle, going all the way through modern political economy, democracy is generally considered to be a corrective device for inequality. So we have notions that as society becomes more unequal, there's going to be a mobilization of the have-nots to try to change the system in order to share resources more equitably. And that can be done in a democracy in ways that cannot be done in an authoritarian system. So we tend to think of democracy as producing that. And in large part, that seems to have worked in many countries, not all, and maybe it's no longer working in other countries. So one of the things we observed, especially when we were writing the book in 2003 and 2004, was that many of the arguments that economists made for why income inequality was going up in the United States were also true about the advanced democracies of Europe and also in Japan, yet those countries witnessed much less increases in inequality. So we wanted to see why the U.S. was different. And just before I move on, let me just show you a couple pieces of evidence that the United States is different. So here are again using these Gini indices. So here we can see Sweden, one of the lowest Gini indices, and the bar is what the Gini indices was in 1985, and the arrow, I believe, is 2005. So these are 20-year increases. So as you can see, as I mentioned, the United States has one of the highest levels. There's the United States, higher than any country other than Mexico, and also one of the largest increases despite its very high level. Okay, so that's one of the puzzles, is that we've had this very high level of economic inequality. It's growing. The political reaction was not to reduce it. In fact, I'm going to argue because of polarization, the effect was to do less to remedy those problems. Here's another piece of evidence. These are the top income shares across countries, these top 1% that I mentioned before. One of the interesting things is during the period of time in which the United States wasn't very polarized, the United States did not look that differently than France, Canada, UK, or Japan, which are the only countries on here. It's really during this period of polarization. So clearly these technological shocks that produce economic inequality hit lots of countries, but they seem to have hit the United States the hardest, and we argue that's a consequence of our politics. Okay. So our argument is that really, again, we don't want to say that there's any single cause for these relationships, that, it's really economic inequalities driving everything or the polarization driving everything. Our argument is that there's really several reinforcing relationships that account for these trends. They kind of fit together in kind of a vicious circle, if you will, where they're mutually causative, and therefore it kind of makes it hard to think of ways to kind of break through. So let me just talk a little bit about some of these connections. So we think about immigration and its role in economic inequality. Some evidence is actually not terribly strong evidence, but there is some, and lots of discussion in economics about the extent to which migration creates competition in the low wage market, which helps kind of produce economic inequality by driving down lower wages. That's probably not the first order effect. Second order effect is that migration has been a big boon to agricultural interest and the corporate interest in the United States, which has really produced high levels of economic growth, whose gains have mostly been captured, again, by this top 1%, this top 0.1%, et cetera. So immigration has some impacts on economic growth, which has primarily been captured by the top, so therefore it produces inequality. A second feature, which we spend more time on the book because it's not something that people have focused a lot on, is that since the 1960s, immigration in the United States has primarily been economic migrants. It's primarily been achieved through family reunification. So people who enter the United States, perhaps not always are the kind of the highest wage, most educated immigrants. We have a very different system than, say, Canada, which prioritizes skills and backgrounds. We don't, for humanitarian reasons. So what this created is a very large fraction of our lower income residents of the United States are immigrants who do not have the franchise or not entitled to vote. So what it's done is it's kind of diluted the voting strength of the lower income groups. The lower income groups in the United States are more composed of immigrants and non-citizens than they were before, and that sort of dilutes their strength, which means that our leftist party, the Democratic Party, picks up fewer votes by promoting policies for low-wage workers because they can't return the favor in votes. And it also allows the Republican Party to kind of even more move away from those sorts of policies that will help low income. And then finally, immigration is a situation with inequality and polarization, which have been very hard to find the political compromises necessary to make the trade-offs between border security and the humanitarian goals of kind of regularizing the status of the people who are already in the United States. Let's talk briefly about inequality. So inequality, again, the primary driver is it creates political conflict over redistribution. As the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, mainly in the United States, it's been the rich getting richer and the poor staying the same. The more conflicts over how to divide that pie. Economic inequality, especially as it's meant rising real incomes, has sort of moved the Republican Party to the right, as I showed you, but a much smaller effect on the Democratic Party since most of the effect has been at the top. And of course, as I mentioned before, this increases the demands for immigration by upper classes. And finally, I think what kind of brings it all together is that political polarization in our system is conducive to producing gridlock. We have a system where it takes very large bipartisan consensuses to make new policy, even under the best of situations, and that's become much, much harder to do. Major reforms in the United States, primarily, especially to our welfare state, took place in the 1960s, where there was less polarization and the Democratic Party was much stronger. Today, we've had much less meaningful reforms. In fact, our most significant reform, the Affordable Care Act, passed under President Obama, happened at a kind of a rare time when the Democratic Party was large enough to pass it. And now that the Democratic Party is out of power, the Republicans are doing everything they can to undermine it. Okay, and so this kind of gridlock helps produce economic inequality and sustain it, and also contributes to a lack of immigration reform. Okay, let me move past this. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about is some more recent work actually showing that there's actually a pretty strong causal relationship between economic inequality and polarization, but it's kind of different than what we might have expected, and so I think it helps reinforce some of these trends. So there really, again, is going back to the previous slide, there are really two ways in which economic inequality and polarization can be related through reciprocal causation. One is the policy channel, that polarization produces gridlock, which produces inequality. And there's some evidence for that. As I showed you, polarization clearly often comes first in the Piketty-Saez series. But there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical that the relationship is causal. There's a lot of things that we statistician-like people talk about as omitted variables that are very important. One is the rise and fall of mass immigration itself. I've already showed you that they're connected, so we have to rule that out. Clearly, wars have an impact on polarization and inequality. So there are good wars like World War II, which, I mean, a lot of people died, but some of its consequences were good. It reduced polarization, reduced economic inequality. There are bad wars in the context of the United States, Vietnam and Iraq, which increased polarization without doing anything for inequality. There are economic crises, the Great Depression, stagflation in the 1970s, the recent global financial crisis, and then the role of various civil rights movements. So what we'd like to be able to do to say that economic inequality causes polarization is to try to eliminate some of these effects and also to get more data on the relationship. So one of the ways that we've done this recently is to look at the American states. Just like the United States, and there's variation across the United States and Europe in levels of economic inequality. There's lots of variation across American states, from California to Texas to New York, in both the levels and the trends. And there's also variation in the extent to which those political systems are polarized. Democrats and Republicans are different in different states. So we're able to use the fact that we can identify changes in inequality at the state level with changes in the polarization to get a better sense of whether or not there's actually a strong relationship. So like the federal government, using very similar measures, we can show that state politics is polarized greatly from the 1990s to 2016. We can't go back any further. And it varies a lot across the regions of the United States. So less polarization in the southern United States, much more in the western United States, where California, Oregon, Washington, etc. So we can use this to kind of test to see whether or not there's a relationship. Polarization, here's how it's sort of changed over the almost 20 years, going from low to high, and it tends to, as you can see, it's tended to get darker in almost every part of the country. And economic inequality varies a lot across states. And to kind of foreshadow the result, you can kind of see that the areas that were getting greener in terms of polarization are getting greener in terms of economic inequality. So here's what we found. I won't bore you with the details. But we found that inequality increases polarization by making the Democratic parties of states more left-wing. That's sort of what you would expect. More inequality, more demands for redistribution and government services. Democratic parties should respond by becoming left-wing. But that's not what happened. What economic inequality does is it makes Democratic parties smaller by eliminating their more centrist members and replacing their more centrist members by Republican legislators. So economic inequality has produced a rightward shift in the politics of these states. It also makes Republican legislators more conservative. And the effect is only getting stronger over time. So overall, economic inequality, contra Aristotle and modern political economy, economic inequality is not only polarizing, but it's also shifting politics in a rightward direction, an anti-government direction, if you will. So a couple of reasons why this could be happening. One is just the unequal participation of voters in the United States. So the poor are very unlikely to vote in the United States. So this figure shows for each income level the number of non-citizens, the number of citizens who don't vote, and then the number of citizens who do vote. As you can see, higher incomes, the more citizens who vote, fewer non-citizens who don't vote, and then obviously at the bottom here are the non-citizens, which are concentrated. So when economic inequality increases and the poor don't vote, the effect is only felt by the right. And it's also muted by the high levels of immigration and people who can't participate. So that's a small effect. But perhaps the larger effect, and I think more relevant to our discussions of inequality, is the concentration of campaign contributions among the wealthy. So this bottom line of the figure is the Piketty-Saez series of the percent of income going to the top 1%. And when scaled differently, it's a dramatic increase. But when you scale it against the percentage of contributions coming from that same tippy top of the income distribution, it pales in comparison. So this is the percentage of total campaign funding coming from the top 10th of 1% in the United States. In 1980, it was obscene. The top 10th of 1% gave 15% of the campaign contributions to federal candidates. But it's only gotten worse. So is that as of 2012, and it's worse in 2016, that over 40% of the campaigns at the federal level were funded by the very richest Americans. And that sort of effect cannot help but kind of move politics to the right. Clearly, there are progressive left-wing billionaires who give money to lots of causes, but their total largesse pales in comparison to the money coming from the right. Okay. So let me try to wrap up somewhat briefly, and as promised, talk a little bit about Donald Trump in 2016 and how he fits into all this. To some sense, he's a kind of an enigma because he's not the typical Republican office holder that's been driving much of these changes over time. He's very heterodox with respect to the Republican Party. So when I talk about Republicans moving to the right over most of this period of time, I mean that they're moving primarily in a much more kind of free market, anti-government, anti-regulation, anti-tax type direction. Donald Trump doesn't quite fit that mold exactly. In fact, from 2001 to 2011, he wasn't even a Republican. He ran for president he tried to get a nomination to a third party, the Reform Party, in 1999, and said very un-Republican things about the need to increase taxes on the wealthy and the need to protect the welfare state. So his emergence falls somewhat outside the mold. As we all know, one of his big appeals is kind of ethnic nationalism. It is true that the Republican Party over most of this period was the party that was most comfortable with restrictive policies on immigration, but he takes that one step further and is a restrictionist on immigration that far exceeds the kind of establishment Republicans. Establishment Republicans have always been looked quite favorably upon moderate levels of immigration for economic reasons, especially looked favorably upon high-skilled immigration. Donald Trump is very different from the party with respect to that. As we also know, he departs quite greatly from the kind of free market mantra on international trade. He's an avowed nationalist and therefore anti-globalist, and has sought to, with varying degrees of success, to rewrite global trading rules, or mostly bilateral trading rules, for that matter. So he's somewhat of an enigma. But because he's kind of an enigma within a party that's been built around these other sort of orthodoxies with respect to economics, the things that he's had the most impact on are those things that the traditional conservatives have an overlapping interest. Much attention has been paid recently to his role in judicial appointments. Almost all of his judicial appointments have been very conservative, orthodox people. There's this organization in the United States known as the Federalist Society, which is going back to the 1980s, has tried to develop a set of conservative judicial scholars who are primarily interested in kind of holding the line on regulation, the welfare state, as well as some social issues. He's appointed people of that mold, consistent with what other Republicans would have wanted. His singular legislative success has been in tax cuts, very regressive tax cuts, in the sense of focusing primarily on corporations and high-income individuals. Now, there was a bipartisan consensus in the United States that the corporate tax system needed to be reformed, that our rates were too high, that there were too many loopholes. So when President Trump came in with the Republicans who opposed taxes, their response was, okay, we'll reduce the corporate tax rates, but we're not going to do anything about the loopholes unless they're loopholes of people we don't like. And then we're going to also reduce, at the same time we're reducing corporate tax rates on dividends, we're going to reduce tax rates on wealthy individuals as well. And then the third feature of Trump's sort of successes has been in terms of regulatory rollback, his ability to, through executive power, to eliminate a set of regulations on the environment and the economy that have been built up over time. So in a lot of ways, he still is governing like an orthodox Republican. Yet on these issues in which he's less constrained by his own party, trade, immigration, etc., he's been able to carve a different path. And obviously, in concluding, and I think this will be a major topic for the discussion, there's also the extent to which his style of American politics is very much outside the norm. In fact, one of the things he's known as is a norm breaker. His ability to vilify his opponents, attack his opponents, to threaten the use of state power against political opponents is something that's kind of deeply troubling, despite the fact that in some sense he is just a continuation of these 40-year trends that I've discussed. Okay, so let me start there.
Thank you very much.
Please. Oh.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I'd like to ask you in the beginning here, you write in your book that America today is what it was like 10 years ago, only worse. How worried are you?
I think I'm concerned about lots of things. I think in some sense, given the research I've done, the things about judicial appointments, tax cuts, regulation, those are all totally predictable. I am worried about the norm breaking, the vilification, the failure of other political elites to hold Donald Trump in check. One of the things that you would hope for in a system where there's a challenge, say, coming from the far right, is that the center left and the center right could somehow coalesce in ways to kind of hold it in check and to fight it off. That totally has failed in the United States. Donald Trump has captured one of our major political parties. That party, while it's been able to constrain him on some policy issues, has not been able to constrain his worst impulses in terms of the vilification of opponents, the threats, etc. And so I'm very concerned that that's going to more deeply polarize society as voters start to respond to both pro and negative Donald Trump in ways that become irreconcilable. And it plays out in terms of like the types of policies we get. On some issues, Donald Trump and the Democrats are quite in sync. They both are skeptical of free trade agreements. They both would like to spend a lot more money repairing the United States' damaged infrastructure. But because of the way he behaves in office, this vilification of his opponents, it's impossible to work together, even on areas in which they agree in principle. And so I think the longer-term repercussion is just deteriorating governance, as well as social polarization, and an inability for government to do anything that would be broadly popular across society.
You mentioned briefly regular American voters and the polarization within this general group. What do you see when it comes to ordinary people?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the polarization of the parties came first, but the voters have started to catch on and catch up and so to start to follow those leaders. And so now what we see among the public is that the public is much more sorted into camps, a Republican camp and a Democratic camp. Those camps tend to be more internally homogeneous, so that only conservative voters identify with the Republicans, only liberal voters identify with the Democrats. And so that's a big change. And what it's created is something that we've called affective polarization, that now Democrats and Republicans just don't like each other socially, and they're just antagonistic socially, culturally, and so forth. So an interesting fact that's been made much of in recent years is that we've asked a polling question in the United States over 40 years. How would you feel if your son or daughter married someone of a different race? And of course, in the U.S. in the 1960s, there was a very high number of people who would be uncomfortable with their child marrying someone of a different race. And it's gone down over time. Now we started asking people, how would you feel if your son or daughter married somebody from a different political party? That has skyrocketed, and the discomfort of intra-party marriage is higher than the discomfort with interracial marriage in the U.S. in the 1960s. And so it's a quite dramatic social antagonism that's been created, in large part because if my son were to bring home a daughter from a different party, I would know what her position on every single issue was because of this kind of social sorting. And if I didn't like those issues, I might, have a hard time relating with my new daughter-in-law. So it is a very significant social phenomenon, in addition to just bigger policy differences.
Leads me to the next question. I wonder what comes first, really? Is it the public, the general public, that have become more polarized themselves before the politicians, or who are leading this?
I think the politicians have led it for the most part. And by that, I mean broadly. I think, politicians have polarized. Sympathetic media has polarized at the same time. So that voters are getting messages from their leaders to say that the other side is un-American or bad, that their policy views are evil, or whatever the kind of strong, harsh language that our political leaders are using. I think they're doing this in large part because they have different ideologies, different partisan positions. They really want to win to be able to implement those, and then they're stoking these conflicts among voters to help themselves win elections. One of the striking things about the Trump era is that Donald Trump is seen as some kind of political guru because of his ability to mobilize his base. His base is about perhaps 35% of the population. It's a very large number, but it's not 50%. There's never any sense that he should or any other politician should do anything to kind of persuade the other side. It's just simply to kind of mobilize a core set of supporters. And so in the near future, almost all elections will be this core of voters versus this core of voters, and who can turn out to the polls more. It's a very unhealthy situation to be in, a situation where the politicians no longer want to persuade voters, but only to antagonize them in order to get them to come and vote.
Thank you. I'd like to open up for questions. Please, don't be shy.
Yeah, there was one back there.
Okay, hold on. A microphone is coming your way.
My name is Ulf Löwenhav with Henley Business School. Your perspective is very from a statistic point of view. If I were here as an anthropologist, I would look at tribalism as something, because you say Republicans become very predictable, so are Democrats. Would you include tribalism as a driving force or causality?
Yes and no. Of course, what I would want to know is, where the tribalism came from, why it's so strong now relative to before. So that's clearly true. Tribalism is a word that gets used a lot to describe American politics. I have one reservation about it, which I think is an important one. When I think of tribalism, I think of kind of social identity theory in general. I think you have a very strong commitment to people on your side, and therefore but you also don't like the out group. In the United States, it's much more asymmetric. Republican voters don't particularly like the Republican Party. They just really dislike the Democratic Party. And the same is true of the Democratic Party. The most Democratic activists are so upset with the Democratic Party over what happened in the previous election that they just want to wash their hands of the whole thing, except for their hatred of the Republican Party. So it's it is tribal, I agree with that, but it's kind of a funny tribalism. I don't really like my tribe very much, but the other one is really bad.
Other questions? Yes, hold on.
My name is Jan Peter Axelsson. I'm freelance for Green Post. Maybe you said in the beginning, but can you say more clearly what you mean with polarization and how you measure it?
Sure. So conceptually what we mean by polarization is kind of the increasing prevalence of extreme viewpoints. Or conversely, when we're thinking about parties, it's kind of the ideological and distance between those parties. So here, so that we can have a measure that going back as long as we do, we look at how individual legislators vote on legislation. And so it's a statistical procedure, but it has a very kind of common sense feel to it. Right-wing legislators are those who vote with right-wing legislators all the time. Sometimes vote with centrist legislators and never vote with left-wing legislators. Left-wing legislators are the opposite. They always vote with the left. Sometimes they support centrists, and they never vote with the right. And then the centrists are those who vote sometimes with the left, sometimes with the right. So what we're seeing when we see these pictures moving apart in the measurement is we're seeing primarily that there are fewer centrists. There are almost no set of legislators that sometimes vote with the left and sometimes vote with the right. They almost always vote with one bloc or the other. We're also saying that there are very few instances in which the left and the right blocs vote together at all. So there's almost no kind of coalition building that cuts across the ideological spectrum. That's all disappeared. It was very different in the 1950s and the 1960s because there were centrist Democrats who voted with the Republicans on a lot of economic issues. There were Republicans who voted with conservative Democrats on civil rights issues, and so there was a wide range of these kind of centrists. They're just simply gone now. It's become that every American knows every centrist in the Senate because there's two. It used to be there were like 20 of them. Now it's Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. They're household names simply because they're the only Republican senators who are occasionally willing to vote with the Democratic Party.
Okay, one more question, briefly.
Hi, my name's Davina. I'm from the London University. You touched very briefly on how war affects polarization. And I've read that in the Cold War there was such a rise of nationalism. So I'm just wondering why you mentioned the examples of the Iraq War and the Vietnam War, why they caused such polarization and the Cold War didn't.
Sure. So yes, it's true that the Cold War, the World War II and then the subsequent Cold War produced a lot of nationalism in the United States. But it was a nationalism that was shared by the left and the left and the right. There was such a thing called like the Cold War liberals, people like John F. Kennedy, who were took very strong stands against the Soviet Union. In fact, John Kennedy won election in 1960 primarily by pointing out that Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican, had let the United States fall behind in terms of its numbers of nuclear missiles. So there was a nationalism. There was bipartisanship. Bipartisanship is not always a good thing. I mean, bipartisanship led us into the Vietnam War very clearly because that was a Democratic started war. It was continued by a Republican administration. So that's right. So bipartisanship is not always necessarily a good thing, but nationalism after the Cold War did produce that. And that all broke down, of course, in Vietnam. People realized the limitations of American power. The left wing of the Democratic Party primarily took on that role, and there was a deeper divide over national security. The other thing the Vietnam War did was that Lyndon Johnson, because it was an unpopular war, decided that he did not want to raise taxes to pay for it, much like George Bush did in Iraq. And so the economic problems coming out of the fact that Lyndon Johnson was pursuing the Great Society expansion of the welfare state, at the same time financing a big international war, created the economic problems of the 1970s, which are much more connected, to my story.
Thank you very much. You'll be back on stage in just 15 minutes' time. Thank you. And obviously, polarization is not only a problem in the United States. We also have our fair share of that here in Sweden. Hot topic, not to say the least. And now we'll hear about the Swedish perspective. And please join me in welcoming Lars Trägårdh, Professor of History and Civil Society Studies at Ersta, Sköndal, Bräcke University College. Now it's time for an applause.
Now it's working. Okay, great, thanks. Thanks a lot. It is a really depressing story, and I think I mentioned to you as we met here last night, my American wife was telling me about the latest letter bombs being sent off, supposedly from, right-wingers to the Obama, Clinton, and so forth. Of course, we shouldn't make too much out of that, but it is a sort of sign of the times in a way, and having myself lived in the U.S. almost 40 years, in fact, arriving in 1970, which is kind of also interesting given your story, this is also a fairly personal matter, for myself. I will say things about Sweden, but I do want to just begin a little bit more broadly and then say something about the U.S., which is partly a kind of common party question, really, for you. The first thing I want to say is something that you bring up towards the end of the book, that there is also here somewhere a story about the decline of trust, both trust in institutions and social trust between people. And I think this is something which we've been seeing and been discussing a lot in a comparative way. And here I think the stories, let's say, about the US and the UK versus, let's say, Sweden and Denmark, they tend to diverge, or at least until recently, right? So that in the U.S. We can think of a kind of the vanishing middle, both in politics, but also in terms of social structure. And one of the key things to understanding the durability of social cohesion here in the Nordic countries has been the relative strength, of the middle in both in the economic sense, but also political sense. And I think again points to what you're talking about, namely the connection, between these two. But clearly, this question of trust, I think, is a key. You brought up also in your book a fair amount about the discussions about taxes, and I think it's one thing that I like to point out when I talk about trust is that perhaps the most obvious expression or sign or proof of a high trust country is the willingness to pay taxes. Right? And I think that the resistance, in a way, to taxes in the United States is also an expression of that degree of distrust. There is no functioning social contract anymore, right? So why would you want to pay? Why wouldn't you, as you would write about, privatize, risk as much as possible? So that, I think, it clearly is very important theme that's also in your book. Now, the question I had for you, which comes from a reading that I did just recently by an article by Thomas Edsall, who is a frequent commentator and has written a lot, since his book Chain Reaction, on these developments in the U.S. He is claiming now, having gone through a number of research, that we see also, aside from this rightward drift of the Republicans that you emphasize as the kind of the key difference in terms of the political polarization, we also see an increased leftward drift of the left of the Democrats in the U.S. This is partly just a question for you to comment on, because in a way it's a little bit not in contradiction to your argument, but it might be something that might be actually coming at the tail end, right? Like you sort of a little bit indicated here. And what I'm interested in here is also what we mean by the left. Because in the book, you at some point suggesting that an aspect of the left drift is also connected to the drift towards identity politics. And one could argue, of course, that this is not so much left as the abandonment, right, of a leftist economic policy, right, connected to a sort of collapse of self-confidence on the Democratic side when it comes to actually having an autonomous economic agenda, right? Going back to sort of creating the Washington Consensus and a sort of a lack of a real true opposition in the economic realm, so that identity politics, if you will, becomes a substitute, right, for having economic policy. And that, of course, is a serious question that I think is all relevant to Sweden, in fact. Now, turning then to Sweden, I want to first note simply that there are some difficulties in transporting, right, Polarized America to Sweden, right? And I won't speak too much about it, but just to list a few things that I will not talk about precisely because it would be like comparing apples with oranges. And so it's not all that helpful to either the Swedish or American analysis. But clearly, we don't have the same political system. I think some degree of a driving force here is actually the American political system with two-party system that I think structurally, right, has an affinity to polarization. At that level. That would be sort of one observation. You also bring up, I think, the new edition too, in particular, a lot of emphasis on campaign financing, which is clearly very important in the U.S. context, less so probably here in Sweden, where we have a very different set of rules in that regard. And then, of course, there is inequality in itself. I mean, we do have a discussion in Sweden about rising inequality, and some alarmist pundits will sort of suggest that Sweden has like some of the highest rate of growth in inequality. But more level-headed observers tend to emphasize that this is from very, very low levels. So that if you look at a Gini coefficient, for example, it's not like Sweden really comes out looking comparable to the U.S. in this way. So it becomes then, even at that level, difficult to sort of compare very effectively the U.S. to Sweden. But I think where there is a really interesting similarity, and that's where I will spend the rest of my comments on, is in the area of immigration. Right? When we're looking at some of the recent work done by some of the political scientists in Gothenburg on polarization, their finding is that there isn't really much evidence for polarization in Sweden. Right? There's nobody here really arguing that we should dismantle the welfare state. I mean, there might be a few people out there somewhere in the woods, but they are not highly visible. And the only area there is polarization is around immigration, in fact. So that takes me then to your, I think, very powerful arguments in your book. And I wanted to kind of sort of just go through that. Some of that you have already gone through, but I wanted to kind of turn it around a little bit towards the Swedish context. Because the way I understand your analysis here is that what we are seeing is a pattern whereby, and this is a great irony actually, right, that what is from a sort of left democratic point of view a bad immigration policy, right, that the very strict regime starting in the 1920s. That was, one could say, xenophobic, racist, right? It was allowing in white immigrants from this country, but not from many other parts of the world where people came from different cultures, different skin color, and so forth, right? So there's a very big argument that one could think of as belonging to not just the left, but perhaps, to the center-right as well. And that propelled indeed the changes that we see from 1965, as you suggest. There are two breaks, right, when it comes to immigration law in the United States. Then your argument, right, and why this becomes so ironic, I think, is that what you are suggesting is essentially that what happens in the United States is then with over time from 1920, we see how the immigrants that were already there become naturalized, become citizens, right? They become effectively part of the social contract, both on the input side as voters and as right holders at the output side. And so this is part of the explanation, right, for both the growth of social cohesion and the lack of polarization, as I interpret it. Right? Now, once we then get into the 70s, after the 1965 reforms, on the other hand, we see that the very well-intentioned immigration reforms, right, meant to open up in a less discriminatory fashion immigration, which, of course, is a central aspect of American national identity, right? The American dream. I mean, I used to joke when I was there. I always point out to my American friends that I said, I'm more American than you are. And they look at me aghast. And I say, well, because I'm an immigrant. You can't both be American and be born in America. That's a contradiction in terms, right? How about that? But what happened after this time, coinciding very much with my own time in the United States, is that and this is what you described so well, is that we see an increasing population of immigrants, both legal and illegal, that are not citizens and that are also poorer. Right? And the consequences in political terms are then quite important, right? Because then they will, so to speak, be outside of social contract, be easily perceived as not rights holders but burdens, to society. And they will not, as you put it so nicely, right? They since they can't vote, they can't return to favor to the Democratic Party, right? So you have a very unfortunate dynamic from the Democratic point of view. And instead we see this sort of polarization in terms of, what are the costs and benefits for different groups in American society. Now, the unintended consequence of all of this, of course, is that from, let's say, a Democratic point of view, what is one ideal, one good, one moral good, namely, right, to be in favor of immigration, not least, as you were pointing out, humanitarian, right, rather than such a high-skilled Canadian-style labor immigration. That, leads, on the other hand, to a breakdown in the other good from the left, namely social equality or economic equality. Right? And one of the big, I think, challenges to the Democrats, which is also true in Sweden, is like, how do you actually negotiate that apparent contradiction? Right? Both as a long-term trend, but also in the current immediate moment. And this goes back to my question about what is going on with the Democrats right now. We've seen a flurry of articles proclaiming now the rebirth of socialism in the United States. I realize these articles are highly exaggerated, but what they are about is sort of Democrats trying to sort of figure out a way out of the trap of identity politics, and in some sense return to a more robust economic policy. And I think that is a very central challenge, right? And ultimately, of course, you would like to be able to do both in some sense, but it's not clear how that actually would work. In Sweden, we see very similar, I think, trends. We've had here for a long time focus on labor immigration, very successful labor immigration, I would argue, from the 1940s up until the oil crisis of 1973, when the economic crisis led to essentially a ban on labor immigration, which to a large extent we're still with, even though there's been some debates and the previous alliance government tried to open for that. And that was replaced then by a embrace of fairly large scale, especially in recent decades, humanitarian refugee immigration. And this, of course, has been viewed as a good, Sweden as a moral superpower, right? And it's been a central kind of part of the agenda for not just the left, I would say quite broadly. There's a lot of popular support for that, a lot of political support for it. But the problem is that it starts to create similar conditions that you are describing for America, right? That is to say, there is a group of people in the country that, as opposed to the earlier period, which was characterized by very high rates of naturalization in Sweden. Sweden was, I think, behind only Canada in that regard, right? And the emphasis was, of course, to making immigrants into citizens, right? So precisely so they would be part of the social contract. Now we see, a broader group that are not, they are neither workers, right, bringing in money through the taxes, nor are they bona fide citizens, right? So they stand outside, and that tends to put into question, right, the politics of solidarity based on social cohesion, social trust, and a functioning social contract. So I think it creates the same conundrum for the center-left, the center-right, as you see in the United States. How do you square that circle? How do you make that apparent contradiction go away? This is all, I think, also overwritten by what you were talking about here in terms of nationalism, globalism, right? The issues is here as well, where precisely because Sweden, maybe as opposed to the US, have this sort of dual commitment, both right to the politics of solidarity within the nation state, the welfare state, and a very prominent commitment as a moral superpower, right, to being a big player, right, in the realm of human rights, foreign aid, and so forth. And this has created a scenario here where the politics of citizenship, just like in the United States, have started to retreat. And we see instead a greater emphasis on human rights, on sort of the global perspective, where the nation state itself becomes a object of criticism for being intrinsically xenophobic, possibly even racist, right? And so the left, just like the United States, have abandoned nationalism, right? Nationalism now solely a bad thing. Which means, of course, it becomes very much a property of someone like Trump in the US, or in the Swedish case, Sweden Democrats. And as we now see an increasing number of articles pointing out, abandoning the nation state for the left, given that the nation state is absolutely central to social cohesion, the politics of solidarity, indeed democracy itself, historically speaking, it seems to me a very grave, I could even call it an error. And at least it's a very big challenge that we are facing in both Sweden and in the United States. It's a big conundrum, I think, and it's unclear to what extent anybody is moving forward. I'm looking at my papers. I'm a little unsure if I should stop speaking. I think I should, right?
Oh, this
and I think I'm actually at the point we can continue the discussion, but these were the central issues that I wanted to bring out. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Please. So well behaved. Very good. Please. And I will open up for questions very soon. Thank you very much. Nolan McCarty, maybe you'd like to comment on that specific question to begin with regarding the left drift of the Democrats.
Sure. Overall, I'd like to thank for the very great comments and kind of drawing the connections between the U.S. And Sweden. I just want to say the issue of trust, I think, is really central. One of my concerns going forward is the situation we're going to find ourselves in the United States where no single voter can trust the things that the other parties are doing, and therefore parties are not going to be able to successfully govern. And I think trust, cohesion matters a lot. One of the things, and this highlights some of the things he said about immigration, one of the things about immigration is meant that as the racial and ethnic diversity in society have increased, it's increased the likelihood that arguments against redistribution of the welfare state will be couched in racialized terms. One of the more troubling incidents of the era in which we were passing our Healthcare Reform Act was that many conservative Republican legislators were saying that the only reason the Democrats wanted to do this was to give free health care to immigrants. And so that sort of foreshadows the sorts of debates you probably hear here, you heard around Brexit. And so these issues of immigration's effect on social cohesion, well, they don't play a big role in the book. They're clearly important. It's interesting. Actually, I had one more slide that didn't show, which was like the left-wing response to Donald Trump. So now I get a chance to answer the question about the leftward drift. So the journalist that was mentioned, Tom Edsall, is a good friend of mine. I think he asked me to ask for my opinion about that piece that he was writing. I was busy. I don't think I responded, which is probably good because he received a lot of pushback on that. There's a quite polarized debate within the left about whether or not the Democratic Party is moving to the left or not. There is some manifestations of that. There have been several instances where kind of more kind of establishment left-wing politicians were defeated by upstarts claiming to be democratic socialists. Of course, as you mentioned, that's sort of overdrawn because you look at the platform of the Democratic Socialists of America, it doesn't look like socialism at all. There's nothing about the nationalization of the means of production or anything like that. It's really about kind of maybe social democracy, increasing the role of the federal government in providing social welfare. So there's kind of a style-substance debate going on, question about how much is substance, how much is style, and so that's going forward. I mean, the Republican politicians obviously have every incentive to say that the Democratic Party is pushing very hard to the left. My take is the evidence is that there's some movement in that direction. Perhaps it'll develop more over time, but it hasn't really happened yet. But I do want to emphasize the point that was made, which I think is extremely important, is the tension in the American left between identity politics and kind of redistributive economic policies or more regulation of the market economy. So in 2016, as many of you may know, Bernie Sanders, the only member of the Senate who actually identifies as a socialist, was the second place candidate to Hillary Clinton. He's as close to kind of a Nordic welfarist as there is in American in politics. And his central challenge in getting the nomination was his inability to do very well in terms of the identity politics. He was challenged for kind of putting forward kind of a race-neutral vision of social solidarity and building of an American welfare state, and was challenged by activists like Black Lives Matter and other. They're more tightly related to kind of civil rights, identity questions, and so that tension is really there. Perhaps that tension will resolve itself over time as these two things get connected more tightly. But that tension is clearly present in the Democratic Party now. And if I were to make kind of a disparaging comment about the Democratic Party at this point, is that the only thing that really unifies them at this point is their opposition to Donald Trump. And so my concern is that if they were to win the legislative elections and take over the lower house, is that because they don't have a large-scale agreement on what they would like to do with government, that they will spend most of their time focusing on investigating the president. That needs to be done. There are plenty of things to investigate. But the Democratic Party going forward will have to find some unifying force other than hatred for Donald Trump.
Thank you. Lars Trägårdh, you pointed out similarities and differences, obviously, regarding political polarization in the US and Sweden. Is there anything that you say, in short, that we in Sweden can learn from the research done about polarization in the US in our context?
Well, the one reason I was bringing up the whole topic of immigration is precisely because I think this is extremely and extraordinarily important for our debate here, because you have in the U.S. a much longer history, right? Your data, it's big data. They go way back in time. We don't really have anything quite like that here, so it's very instructive. So I think that absolutely we can learn about. Of course, there's other things to learn as well. Inequality is a bad idea, but we sort of knew that from before. And the political system, campaign finance, and so forth. But I think the immigration issue is really the key. Sweden and the U.S., when they're both at their best, and I like both of these countries very much, are countries that are relatively free, in fact, from a deep ethnic form of nationalism. If you look in data measuring Swedes answering the simple question, what is important for you to be counted as Swedish? Right? We find in our most recent trust survey that a overwhelming majority choose to follow Swedish laws and rules. A very, very small group is saying that it's important to be born in Sweden or having Swedish-born ancestors. Right? And in fact, we have less emphasis on that even than the United States, as a Pew Foundation study showed not too long ago. So there's a powerful potential here, right, for both being open societies. But both cases, this has to be balanced with what I think we've had problems with, both in Sweden and the United States, namely creating a common we, right? Diversity is only a good thing if it is packaged within a common we, right? And that's, has been something that's been powerful in the United States, and around which we have a very tortured debate right now here in Sweden. People think that if you even speak about that, that's racist by definition. And I think actually diversity to be super productive, has to happen within frames where we actually do things together, right? A workplace, for example. If we just throw people together without work in a neighborhood, they are more likely to start gangs and fight with each other. Yeah. So there I think we also have a lot to learn, because Sweden is, in fact, now an immigrant society, just like the United States is. So we have a lot of common facts here and common experiences and common challenges, and we have a lot to learn from each other.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. No, I think the immigration connections are probably the strongest. I would draw one analogy to the current Swedish political crisis or situation, however you'd like to refer to it, that has a strong parallel with what happened in the United States in 2016. So when Donald Trump announced in 2015 that he was running for president, no one took him very seriously, for lots of very good reasons, one of which, as I mentioned earlier, he'd only been a Republican for a few years. But there were 15 other Republican candidates for president, and so none of them really had any incentive to kind of coalesce to kind of head off the threat that Donald Trump posed to our political system. So until the very end, there was never any attempt by the more centrist establishment people of the Republican Party to coalesce around a candidate that could keep Donald Trump from getting the nomination. And that allowed him to get the nomination. And once he did that, the party had to fall in line. Again, I'm not no expert in Sweden, but I see some parallels, and that now there's a tension about whether or not the center-left and center-right can cooperate sufficiently to keep, the Sweden Democrats from having the sort of political power and clout that Donald Trump has obtained in the U.S. And I think there's kind of an important message from the United States about how important it is to set aside these kind of short-run political considerations in order to make sure that, elements that are kind of hostile to the political system don't have the opportunity to, join governments or to wield important power. And so, again, while I agree and the data is there that there's not a huge amounts of polarization in the conventional sense in Sweden, the differences between the Social Democrats and the moderates are not as great as those between Democrats and the Republicans. It's still, this situation on the right is very important, and it would be very important for them to find cooperative solutions to hold it in check. And so I think that's an important parallel in terms of current events.
Very interesting, Lars. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I agree. I still, though, I've argued this about the U.S. situation as well, so I bring it out. I think the problem really is not, I'll stick my head out here, but I think the problem is not so much the Sweden Democrats or even, Trump version of republicanism. I think the problem really is that the Democrats in the United States, as well as the Social Democrats in this country, right, have created that very space, right, by neglecting, right, to put citizenship, a nation state at the center, actually dealing with the fact that social contracts are popular with people, right? Yeah. And by leaving, they basically giving a walkover kind of deal, they've created space. So I think we should be much less focused on the Sweden Democrats, here in this country, and focus more on what the other parties are not doing, right? Because that right now they are certainly not doing anything. So I think that would be my message.
I'm sure there are many questions here. Just over there, I think you were the first one to wave. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Eva Redde. Thank you so much for a very interesting day. It seems like inequality leads to higher polarization, even though the causality might not be proven totally. I read the book, The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger. There is so much evidence that increased inequality leads to increased crime, increased obesity and bad health, increased cost for society that in a welfare state will be paid for by the taxpayers. what we see now, and it's so interesting also, I think, with you, Lars, doing the comparison that the polarization in Sweden is due to immigration. We have not even seen the start of immigration due to lack of water, lack of food, to heat areas in the world to be able to survive. We've seen the immigration from the war of Syria, etc., but that is nothing what is to come. So my question to you is, this polarization, it also has to do with financial reasons. It has increased tremendously the last couple of years, very much connected actually to the development within the digital economy. So that is a technical development that is very difficult to back from. Also in Sweden, the private equity in the financial sectors and some of the entrepreneurs has driven the Gini coefficient up. It will not back off. We also see that the rich people sponsor the campaigns. So the inequality will not lead to less polarization if not these people take a huge responsibility that is not really, we don't really see it today, even though some people do some of it, but not enough. So my question is, what can be done in order to avoid a collapse of the democratic system and the welfare state as we see it today on an individual level? And I see this is also connected to the climate challenges we have and also the allocation of international capital. I've been working 30 years in the capital sector. Today we have a board meeting at AP1, one of the state-owned AP funds where I'm on the board. And one of the main topics is how to increase the allocation to sustainable investments. But I think time is we have very little time. And I spoke with a 16-year-old girl yesterday, and she said, I think it is too late. So this is the sense of many people in the younger generation. And sometimes I also ask myself, I will, of course, do my utmost to try to work to reallocate the global capital towards the solutions we need to reduce these enormous migration streams we will have and the violence that will come with it. But sometimes I actually ask myself, maybe it is too late. And my question to you, very informed people, what can be done not to destroy the democratic system, the welfare states, the solidarity, the trust? Time is running, and the climate change is kind of putting the burden on us in a very, very fast space. Just look at the last IPCC report and you find out. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Big question, but
yes.
Go ahead.
So as your observations suggest and as my research suggests, it's a very hard dynamic to get out of. And so it's very hard to think of things that can be done. My simple answer is, democratic systems, mainstream establishment parties just simply have to do, when given the opportunity, have to do a better job at restoring the confidence of typical voters in doing them. So your observation about the Social Democrats, I think, is spot on. So there was David Frum, who's an American columnist who writes for The Atlantic, said this week and pointed out, given the kind of impending situation on our southern border right now with a caravan of 7,000 Hondurans and Guatemalans, that very similar to Lars's point, that the Democratic Party has to address those issues and the concerns that voters have. They can't just simply blame Donald Trump for the restrictive policies. And so his line was that if the Democrats tell the voters that only fascists want to control immigration, then they're going to hire fascists to control immigration. And so I do think that, establishment parties have to be responsive to these issues and not think that they're simply all related to xenophobia or racism or whatever. They have to take these seriously. So I agree with that, and I think that's an important step. I also think when they're in government, they have to take baby steps. They have to, they have to make concrete policy changes that voters are going to kind of accept, move forward with, and trust. In that sense, actually, the American healthcare reform is somewhat of a success. One of the reasons the Republicans were not able to repeal it is because it got implemented. There are things about it that voters like. There are things about it that even Trump's voters like. And so it made it very hard for them to repeal. So I think it takes these small steps of concrete reforms that the voters will accept, that the voters will understand, is in their interest, and to take the voters seriously when they say we're concerned about immigration or other things. I think to use Lars' emphasis on trust, it's rebuilding the trust in kind of established democratic institutions, and the most fundamental institutions of democracy are the political parties. And if the establishment parties collapse, then democracy is going to collapse.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that there is a sort of tendency among some who are taking a kind of a global perspective, not least those coming from, let's say, an environmental position, right? To think of like global solidarity, let's say, as a global responsibility, and we have moral duties, right, towards, let's say, refugees, not just from Syria, but let's say climate refugees. I think, however, the problem is that if we don't realize that if we're going to build a global order, we have to learn something from the United States. It has to be a federal order. We can't bypass the nation state. That's the only democracy we have. If we fail, in our pedagogical job towards our own citizens, forget about democracy at a global level, right? So we're going to have to begin here. The risk is if we sort of start to lean towards open borders, right, even for good reasons, you're going to see a development of the privatization of risk, like you were talking about. We're going to see ghettos for the poor and gated community for the rich, right? So you're going to have to start working on what a lot of the rich people don't like to hear about, but a global tax regime, right? Be nice to see if some of the really rich, instead of cheating on their taxes, went out and said, since we are so powerful, we will start a commission to try to, work out something reasonable that's good for business and good for human beings, right? But you're going to have to work from the bottom up. You can't really bypass citizen. I totally agree with your, the arguments that you're repeating. If the Democrats can't get a grip on the fact that this is a, democracy with citizens who vote, they are going to lose elections.
Time's running fast, but I think we will have time for one last question from the audience. Yes, please. And please keep it short.
Hi, my name is Sanna Björling. I have actually two questions, but I'll keep them short. So one is, I think it's very interesting to hear that you talk about it coming from the leaders and the political leaders. And it would be interesting to hear if this is something that you see also in other countries where polarization is growing, and that it does not come from the bottom. And the other one is, if we look at not least the United States, one of the big differences between how people vote, and increasingly so, is the level of education of voters. And could that be a way of decreasing polarization, or, going for education? Because you could see how their beliefs is a very strong correspondence with how educated people are.
So let me take the first one very quickly. So the typical pattern, I think, in many European countries has been something like where the establishment parties either just simply lose popularity or they converge on issues like immigration and all the issues that Lars mentioned in Sweden. And then there's something that comes in from the right or even from the left, like in Spain or Greece. And so polarization is very different in that it's kind of this either convergence of the establishment parties away from what voters want or just their lack of popularity. But one of the things that scholars have really puzzled over is like predicting where populist movements will gain strength and strengthen. So the original starting point was to look at a sociological profile of voters to see whether is it, blue class voters, is it increasing numbers of blue class, is it increasing unemployment, increasing whatever. And those correlations are extremely weak. What it really seems to boil down to is that in some countries, political entrepreneurs on the right or the left tackle the tough job of organizing, and under certain circumstances they're successful. So there is some evidence that it's even a top-down process when we're talking about mobilization on the far right. It's these entrepreneurs who try very hard over long periods of time to mobilize those bases. It's not necessarily an organic demand of certain types of voters for polarization. The question on education, I think is an interesting one. obviously, in the United States, there's a big divide between the college-educated and the not college-educated in terms of their political preferences and their partisanship and their views. It's hard to know to the extent to which that's causal, that if we took all the uneducated people and educated them, that it would change them, or it's just simply a reflection of cultural differences in different parts of the country. It's hard to know. One of the things that people have focused a lot on is the kind of the filter bubble, the media bubble, and that people just aren't getting the right sources of information. Recent studies have shown that's all wrong. Actually, if you take a right-wing American voter and force them to listen to MSNBC, which is our center-left channel, they become more right-wing. And if you take a left-wing voter and make them watch Fox News or conservative station, you make them more left. You make them more left-wing. There seems to be kind of fundamental ways of viewing the world that are differing across partisans. That even when they're exposed to the new information, they not only resist it, but they act against it. And so that makes me a little bit skeptical that it's just simply a matter of civic education.
Thank you very much, and we'll have to continue the discussion out there in a few minutes' time. But first, please, Mia of Ransin.
Yes, and it's just to say a very big thank you to all of you for a very interesting and very important discussion. I think it raised a lot of issues and also that we can come back to in other seminars. And also thank you to the audience for being involved and asking very interesting questions.